Hi everyone, Syma Khalid from Science of the Times.
And I'm Tim Colson, and welcome to another episode.
So, Tim, what can I see that you're wearing there? Is that some Science of the Times merch?
We have a little bit more merch. Look at this. So it's a t-shirt made from very high quality cotton. Look at that design. That's a design that you came up with, Syma. Beautiful piece of artwork. And yeah, they'll be available on our shop shortly when I get round to setting up the shop.
It looks great. Yeah, it really
It's
does.
really comfortable. It's high quality cotton. Yeah, Rapa Nui is the makers of the t-shirts that we get them
Can't,
printed onto.
can't wait to get my hands on my one.
I've got one here for you.
Cool. So, for this episode, Tim, we have one of your collaborators with us joining us. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so his name's Dan McNulty, and he's someone I met about 15 years ago, and when I started working on the Wolf Project in Yellowstone, and he has been with the Wolfstone since the Wolf Project in Yellowstone since really near the beginning. So I think the he joined in the autumn of the year that the wolves had been released, and they'd been released the previous summer. So he's seen the whole effect of wolves, play out in Yellowstone. And he happened to be in Oxford visiting me, doing some work, and I said, you know what? I've got a hunch that our listeners might be interested in learning a bit about the real story of wolves in Yellowstone.
Absolutely. Nothing like hearing it from well, I was going to say the horse's mouth, but maybe the wolf's mouth.
No, and it's interesting because a lot of people think they know the Yellowstone story because of a video. Is that something you've seen online, that video?
I have indeed. I have. So the impact on rivers and such like.
Yeah, so that was a video that has accrued something like 45 million hits. So it's been very good in many ways, for explaining about Yellowstone, and wolves are good for the ecosystem. But to be honest, nearly everything in that video has subsequently been shown to be wrong. And in fact, we use it as a teaching tool now in Oxford, where we show it to the students. We ask them to go away and identify the errors, and they'll sort of shout, "Stop, stop, stop!" And I mean, it then takes the whole hour to go through the video. But that's not to say that wolves haven't had an effect on Yellowstone. They have. It's just not the way it's described in that video.
Okay, great. So should we get him in and let's let him tell us all about it.
Yeah, let's quiz him, and you'll ask the more pressing questions, I'm sure, because I'll treat him easily.
That's very generous of you, Tim, to say that I'm gonna ask the naive questions.
Well, listeners, welcome to another episode of Science of the Times podcast. And today we have Dan McNulty with us. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Tim. My name is Dan McNulty. I'm a professor at Utah State University in Logan, Utah.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. So Dan and I have actually worked together a little bit over the years in Yellowstone National Park. So it's a real pleasure to have you on. But Syma, knows a little bit less about the park than both of us. So I think, just to ease our listeners in, maybe you'll start with a few questions, Syma. How's that sound?
Absolutely fine. So actually, obviously, I know significantly less than the two of you. But so yeah, Dan, I've been reading about something that I just didn't know anything about. That wolves can have a profound effect on lots of different things, even perhaps change the course of rivers. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. It's a much more complicated picture than that. And I think that's one of the take home messages of the last 30 years of research in Yellowstone, is that it isn't just as simple as dropping wolves in and then magical ecological change occurs. There's actually a lot of other changes that were happening in the system.
Perhaps we should just have a little bit of a history from
Yeah.
the park. So
Starting at what point?
the park was what, formed in 1880 something?
1872.
1872. And there were wolves there then.
Yes, they were being eliminated, from the time of park establishment through to their final extirpation, which is around 1926. And between 1926 and 1995, there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park.
Why
And
did people go there then?
Why did they go to Yellowstone?
No.
To see the bears. People love the bears, and bear numbers were reduced, but they were never eliminated completely. Bears were seen as being more, positive. Wolves were seen as predators that took things away from people. They were seen as a threat to the big game, the elk, the bison.
So Dan, just so I'm clear, so the wolves were deliberately eliminated from Yellowstone.
Yes, they were deliberately eliminated by the Park Service, actually, because they were seen as threats to the big game population, which had been decimated previously by humans in the late 19th century. And so the Park Service was charged with restoring the elk population along with other wildlife populations, and predators were seen as a threat to that interest, to that project. And so that's why they were eliminated.
And so elk, for our listeners, are sort of an American red deer, and like many American things, they're bigger than our red deer.
Right.
But people also went to Yellowstone, of course, to see the geysers.
Well, right, the geysers, right. The geology is really why the park was established. The wildlife was sort of a secondary consideration, and of course, Yellowstone's known, worldwide for the amazing geology, the geysers, the hot springs, all of that. Yeah,
and it's built on a caldera, isn't it? It's not
on a giant
on a caldera
volcano. Yes,
and that went off about 600,000 years ago,
approximately.
Yeah. So, some people say we're due another one.
Well, and the place has only been ice free for about 10,000-12,000 years, so it's a relatively new ecosystem, like a lot of ecosystems here in the place is seen. So we think about Yellowstone as being this very ancient wilderness when we go visit it, but it's actually fairly recent.
Syma, have you been?
No. I mean, I've obviously, like probably many of our listeners, I've been watching the TV show Yellowstone, and the two prequel series to that, and I'd love to go.
Yeah.
Well, next trip, you'll have to come. We have to do a podcast from on location.
I haven't watched a single episode of Yellowstone. I can't bring myself to watch it.
We won't question. Neither have I. We won't question you about that then. So anyway, the wolves were off the landscape for 70 years. Bears were still there, but perhaps a little bit reduced.
Reduced.
What about other predators? Mountain lions, coyotes?
Mountain lions were also reduced significantly. They were removing, the records show that they were removing equal numbers of mountain lions as they were wolves. So lions were really taking a hit and were largely absent from the landscape up until maybe around the 1970s, 1980s or so. And that's when they started sort of, slowly coming back in numbers, mainly because hunting outside of Yellowstone was reduced on mountain lions, and then the few that remained slowly built their numbers up. So when wolves were reintroduced in that 1995 to 1997 period, cougars and grizzly bears were naturally recovering, and grizzly bears were recovering because they were listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act.
So before we get back to the 90s. So what happened in that 70 years then between the 1926 and the wolf reintroduction, which we'll come to in a little bit.
Right. So because the Park Service was interested in restoring and rebuilding the elk population, they intensively managed them at first. They began feeding them inside the park in places, not everywhere, but in places today that we sort of associate with being sort of wild and unmanaged. Back then, they were actually feeding the elk. They were irrigating the land, growing hay, and that sort of thing. And so elk were being concentrated, their numbers were increasing. And when wolves were eliminated, elk numbers at that time, there was concern that there were too many elk, that they had sort of overshot the appropriate number of elk to be in the northern range. And so they actually started removing elk shortly after they had restored their numbers to bring them back to some sort of balance. And I use that word sort of reluctantly, but they wanted to reduce the numbers in order to reduce the effects on riparian vegetation was a big one. So effects on things like willow plants, aspen vegetation. And so from about around the time that wolves were eliminated, elk numbers also started to decline, but that was because they were either culling the elk, so shooting them, or they were live trapping them, putting them on trains and trucks and translocating them elsewhere in the United States to repopulate those elk ranges. So elk in Utah, for example, where I live, trace their ancestry to Yellowstone elk because the elk in Utah, by and large, were hunted out during the 19th century.
Huh.
Wow, so that's remarkable, right? So on the one hand, you sort of do something to protect the elk and help them propagate, and then that sort of goes slightly out of control, and then so you have to take a reverse kind
Yes,
of strategy to then sort of cull that and control those. Is that what happened?
absolutely. And that is a really common outcome of management. We're always playing catch up to what's already happened. We're always 5, 10 years behind and trying to compensate for something that we had done that we thought was appropriate, but we've missed our opportunity to sort of control that action, and so we're playing catch up. So that often happens in conservation.
And so what sort of led to the decision to reintroduce the wolves?
Right. The decision to reintroduce the wolves was purely a legal decision in order to satisfy the requirements of the Federal Endangered Species Act. That was the main motivation. So wolves were listed as an endangered species in 1973. Their numbers in Minnesota, which was the last remaining population, were sort of naturally increasing.
Last population
In the lower 48 United
48
States,
state,
yeah. There were wolves, of course, up in Alaska.
and over in Asia as well.
Of
and
course,
Europe,
yeah. And there were wolves in Isle Royal National Park
Yeah.
as well. So in the United States, back in the 70s when wolves were listed, we had wolves in northern Minnesota and Isle Royal in Alaska. And so the wolves that were listed were the lower 48 United States wolves. Yep. And so because wolves were listed, a recovery plan was initiated in the 1980s to restore them. And there was slowly wolves recolonizing northwest Montana in the 1980s. And the decision was made to fast track that natural recovery with additional reintroductions, sort of to augment that. And they reintroduced wolves in central Idaho and then also in Yellowstone National Park. And the motivation for that was to achieve population recovery, to remove the wolves from the endangered species list and achieve population recovery. That was the primary motivation. It had nothing to do really with ecological restoration. I mean, that was sort of the broad outlines in the background, but the actual legal mechanism that led to this effort and what motivated people was that this was an endangered species in the lower 48 United States, and that's why they did the reintroduction.
And there was some concern, I think, from one or two senators that wolves might recolonize naturally. And is that right?
Absolutely. So there was concern from the senator from Idaho that if wolves had naturally recolonized all of the Northern Rockies from Montana, they would have retained their endangered status as a listed species, which greatly restricts management intervention. If, say, like those wolves were to kill a cow, managers wouldn't be able to go in and move the wolves, kill the wolves, deal with that conflict. They would just continue to kill cows. But as a non-experimental essential or non-essential experimental population under what's called the Section 10J rule, reintroduced wolves had more management flexibility. They were allowed to be moved, to be relocated, and a lot of that happened in the 1990s after they were reintroduced. Lots of wolves coming and going, and it was heavy management, and still is for wolves outside the park.
So, I mean, I understand very little about the sort of nuances about wolf populations, but so the wolves that were reintroduced or came back, do we know about the sort of genetic origin of all these? Can that be traced back? Do we know where they came from?
Oh, absolutely. So the wolves that were released in 1995, those came from Alberta, Canada, and the wolves that were released in 1996, those came from British Columbia. And then there was actually a third release in 1997. Those wolves were actually wolves that were from Northwest Montana. They came from a pack that was called the Sawtooth Pack. Their parents, the parents in that pack were killed because of livestock conflict, and they didn't want to kill the pups. And so the Park Service agreed to take those pups into Yellowstone and release them subsequently from a holding facility in Yellowstone National Park in 97.
So, Syma, if someone asked you to go and catch a wolf, what approach would you take? Have you thought? Oh, you probably never thought about trying to catch.
I think about this all the time, actually, Tim, like every other sane person. So, yeah, I mean, probably with a slingshot or a poison dart. How do you think? What do you think?
Well, so darts is the common practice, but when we were relocating wolves from one pen to another in Yellowstone, we were using giant salmon fish nets that we're actually throwing over
Really?
these wolves. Yeah, because it was safer than using a dart gun. I mean, that was the logic behind it.
But when you caught them in the wild, well, when they were caught
Yeah.
in the wild in Canada and BC, was that with a big net as well?
No,
Yes.
darts. Yeah.
From a
A
helicopter.
dart gun with a helicopter. Yeah.
So you should explain to our listeners, kind of, because it's astonishing actually to see it.
Oh yeah, it's amazing that they can even pull this off. So it was so Carter Niemeyer was the one that did a lot of the captures up in Canada for the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 90s, and it was extremely cold. So you combine Arctic temperatures, you're in a harness, you're leaning out of the helicopter,
The helicopter's low.
the extremely low. I mean, you can see practically touch the treetops. The ground is rushing below you, and you're trying to keep your eye on this wolf that's trying its best to dodge the helicopter, and trying to put a dart into a moving animal while you're in a moving helicopter. I mean, talk about like an impossible task, but they do it. Carter did it. The biologists in Yellowstone National Park do it every year. So it is doable, but it does seem superhuman to me.
And Syma, I thought it would be fun to have a go, but they wouldn't let me. They said I'd be more likely to hit the pilot with the dart than the wolf.
You might fall out of that helicopter. Yeah.
Anyway, so the wolves were taken down to Yellowstone. They were released in June, was it?
No, so they were brought down in January, the first bunch in January of 1995, and then they were put into chain link pens. These were sort of like half-acre pens to acclimate them to those sites in order to keep them in those areas upon release.
Because otherwise they'd have just run back to
The
where they
concern
came
was
from.
that
Yeah.
if you just did a hard release, so it was called a hard release, they would just run back to Canada. And that's kind of what happened with the wolves in Idaho because those wolves were hard release. They didn't use the soft release method, and those wolves ranged much further upon release. The other thing that was different about the Yellowstone reintroduction is that they relocated whole packs into these pens. So, for example, the Crystal Creek pack, which was one of the first packs I started studying 30 years ago, that pack came as one unit from Alberta, Canada, and was placed in the Crystal Creek pen, acclimated for about 10 weeks, and then in March of 1995, were released.
And you joined the project
in
shortly
November of
afterwards.
1995.
Yeah.
Yep. So I had graduated from the University of Colorado in May of 95, and I walked the Continental Divide Trail from approximately Boulder, Colorado, all the way down to Durango. It was like a 500-mile trek over 7 weeks.
Were you lost?
After I finished, was not lost. We had maps, no GPS. After I finished, then I went up to Yellowstone and it participated in the post-release monitoring. So those initial packs had been released, and our job as field technicians was to follow these wolves around using radio telemetry to determine how often they were killing, what they were killing, interactions between packs, monitoring the movements and spatial distribution of the wolves, that sort of thing. I picked up a lot of dead elk.
So is it fair to say that all the wolves that are currently in Yellowstone essentially came from 3 locations originally? So the 2 in Canada you mentioned, and then Western Montana?
Yes, there's been surprisingly little immigration into the population from outside. There's been a couple cases that have come in, into the park itself. There's been more immigrants from elsewhere to areas outside of the park in the public lands that surround Yellowstone National Park. So you have to understand that Yellowstone is sort of this postage stamp in Northwest Wyoming. Okay, that's the boundary. And then around that is a collection of national forest lands that also have some level of protection, varying from very strict to, allowing, development, logging, that sort of thing. And so wolves are inhabiting that area. And a lot of the wolves in that area, not a lot, but some came from elsewhere, from Idaho particularly.
And so these wolves were released. They settled into the park, and they've been studied ever since, along with many of the other animals in the park. So the elk and the bison.
Absolutely. So when I started as a technician, all I thought about every day was wolves. That's all, and what they ate. I was looking at the world purely through the point of view of a wolf's mouth, basically, because I was following what they were killing. And, we would go in, we'd crack open bones to look at bone marrow, that sort of thing. And it wasn't until later that we began to appreciate, really, we being all of us that were studying wolves, the importance of other components of the ecosystem. In particular, the other predators, including human beings. That's a big part of the story, is that these elk that the wolves are eating migrate outside the park, okay, on a seasonal basis during the winter time. And when they do that, they expose themselves to hunting. And so humans, at the same times that wolves were being reintroduced and expanding their numbers, humans were killing large numbers of elk. And that had an impact on the elk population that, to this day, many people don't really appreciate.
So it's sort of, were we going back to where we were sort of prior to 1926 when the elk population was coming down? Wolves then disappeared for 70 odd years. They come back, and then now wolves and humans together are combining, and the elk population's going down again. Is that right?
It's a huge stew, really, of different animals, and yeah, that's what's happening. And so the population, the elk population, was at a record number in 1994, 1993, about 19,000, and that's probably a minimum estimate. And then the following winter, in December of 1994, their numbers started to decrease. And we know that because a count occurred using aircraft. And so now, remember, I said December 1994, the elk population began to decrease. That was before the wolves had even come through the gate in January of 1995. And so the population was starting to decrease prior to the wolf reintroduction. So that's an important point, because when you look at the data, you can see, wolves were dropped in 1995, and that's when the population started to decrease. But actually, the reintroduction happened after the elk decline started. So the wolves didn't trigger the decline. They certainly contributed to it, but other predators were involved in the decline, including humans, the bears, and also the cougars.
So before we kind of move on to how the rivers have changed,
right.
Let's have a quick break as we go to our sponsors.
Hi, Tim. You're looking particularly snazzy today. What are you wearing?
I'm wearing a piece from a company called Grace and Garbo. And actually, you know a little bit more about them than I do, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right, I do. And
you're the fashion queen. Yeah.
I'm also wearing a piece from Grace and Garbo. So this is a delightful knitwear outfit set up in Birmingham. What they do is they source knitwear, quality knitwear from all around the world. So it's vintage, one-off pieces, many of which they then hand embellish, like the one you're wearing today with its beautiful purple flowers. And so they're big on sustainability. Nothing goes to waste. Everything is sort of recycled and reused. And if you want to know more about them, then have a look at the link beneath this episode.
And thank you very much to them for supporting our podcast. Hope their sales soar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace and Garbo.
Well, welcome back. We are here with Dan McNulty. We've been hearing a little bit about the early history of the park, and then we're kind of up to November 95 when Dan has walked half the length of America and has started on the project. And the wolf story is kind of one of the great conservation success stories in many ways. But I think the aim when they released them was in the states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. There were going to be about 300 wolves. I think it peaked at over 1,500, didn't it? In
something around those.
Yeah. So, but let's go back to the park, and perhaps you can tell us. Maybe we should work through what's happened to some of the species. You talked about elk; they were starting to decline. The wolves came back, were reintroduced. What's happened to the elk sort of since the? Why don't we work through sort of elk and bison and a few other other species?
So the elk population continued to decrease until, I want to say, like around 2015, 2016, somewhere around there, sort of their low point. And since then, their numbers have slowly began to recover. And so this last April, they counted approximately 7,300 elk, which is, we haven't had that number for maybe about 10 years or so. So that's a pretty substantial jump from where it's been in the recent past. So they are recovering their numbers. Now, at the same time that was happening, as elk numbers were going down, bison numbers were increasing in northern Yellowstone. So we talk a lot about northern Yellowstone National Park, and we talk about it as if it's its own, park in some respects. And the reason why we focus so much on it is because that's the part of Yellowstone National Park where a lot of wildlife spend the wintertime, because the conditions there in the winter are fairly benign relative to the interior of the park, which is at a much higher elevation.
They're not benign compared to Oxford, Syma. It's pretty cold out there, and it can get down to -30 still.
And that's where we would see the wolves interacting with the elk, and that's why the wolves were reintroduced there in the first place, because it was great wolf habitat, because it's winter range for elk essentially. And when I was there 30 years ago, as a technician, elk were the dominant ungulate. Yeah, occasionally we saw bighorn sheep, and there were some bison. There were about 500 bison. There were mule deer, occasionally moose, but elk were by far the most abundant, animal out there in the landscape. I mean, it was amazing how many elk there were. Now, 30 years later, the dominant ungulate in northern Yellowstone is the bison or buffalo. And now we have approximately 4,000 bison in northern Yellowstone National Park. So we went from 500 to 4,000. When I started 30 years ago, most of the bison in the park were in the interior.
Down in Pelican Valley.
The wolves don't eat the bison?
They do, but eating a bison and attacking a bison, killing a bison is like as something as difficult as maybe you trying to stop a bulldozer with your teeth. I mean, these bison are huge. They're very hard to grab onto. And so, yes, wolves attack and kill them, but not nearly as frequently as they attack and kill elk, simply because they're so big and dangerous. And wolves are really sensitive to the risk of injury. They're very cautious. I mean, your dog Wolfla, he's quite cautious even around the most, dangerous animals. And wolves are the same way. So they'll go for the elk, even when now bison are more abundant. They prefer to eat elk. Elk makes up the lion's share of what wolves are killing. That's not to say that wolves aren't eating any bison. They are, but they're eating the bison that die from other causes. So they're scavenging a lot on bison that die because of exposure to winter conditions, competition during mating. The bulls are rutting, that sort of thing. There's mortality associated with that, and wolves are scavenging on those animals.
And there's about 100 wolves in the park at the moment, something like that. Maybe
yes, 108, I think, is the number.
And sometimes it goes down to about 80 or 90, and then it kind of so it kind of jumps around. One thing that our listeners might be amazed about, the bison story. So they went down to 26 bison. That was the global population of bison, and they've now recovered in the park. They're also farmed a lot now as well, aren't they? And in
right, a lot of those farmed bison are mixtures of cattle with bison. And 100 years ago, 1923, I think, so a little over 100 years ago, was that low point of 26 bison, and that was in the interior of Yellowstone. Well, so in Yellowstone National Park, that was the remnant herd. There were some captive bison in Texas, up in northwest Montana, that were brought into Yellowstone to help augment the population. And so there was a few more than those 26, but not a lot more.
And so elk came down and then have kind of stabilized, going up a little bit now. Yeah. Bison have gone up and are now, as you say, the kind of dominant animal.
Yeah.
What about some of the other herbivores? Things like, what's the story about moose and things like mule deer and pronghorn antelopes? And
so pronghorn are a great, kind of a recovery story themselves, because when I arrived, there was concern that pronghorn in Yellowstone could potentially become extirpated because their migratory pathways had been interrupted in places like Paradise Valley, north of the park. And they also suffered a lot from predation from coyotes on their fawns. Since then, since the reintroduction and the elk numbers have gone down, pronghorn numbers have actually increased significantly. And one of the reasons they attribute to that is less coyote predation on the pronghorn fawns as a result of wolves pushing coyotes around.
Coyotes are smaller than wolves, quite a lot
substantially smaller. Yeah. And then moose numbers have also increased. There's evidence for that. And that's associated or correlated at least with increases in some places of the vegetation that moose eat. So things like willow and aspen. So moose are primarily browsers. They do eat the shrubs, and they have to have those plants in order to survive. And with those plants coming back in places like Blacktail Creek, Crystal Creek, you do find lots of evidence of moose in those areas.
So I guess
And then
something I'm confused about, again, perhaps naively, is that so the elk population has stabilized and is also perhaps on the rise. The bison have also, numbers have increased. We've got more, seems that everything is we're getting more of everything, including the wolves. How does that work out?
Work out in what way? What do you mean?
There's more predators, but the number of the prey is not going down, it's going up.
Oh, but the elk did come down from a high.
Yeah, they came down from a high of about 19,000 to a low of, say, like in 2016 or so, their low was probably 3,000 or so.
So this is a recovery.
Yeah, now the elk numbers have increased since then to about 7,300. And that's a minimum count. There's probably more like 8,000 total in the northern Yellowstone elk population. Because I'm going to confuse you even more by pointing out that there's more than one elk population, because Yellowstone is this plateau. And I mentioned to you all this National Forest Service land that surrounds it. Well, there are elk populations that winter on those Forest Service lands, and they come and they spend summer and they intermingle with the northern Yellowstone herd in summer. And so wolves are eating not only the northern Yellowstone elk, but they're also eating elk from some of those other herds during the summertime when they're all commingled on the summer range.
But so kind of what I think one way of thinking a little bit about what's happened, Syma, is the kind of return of the wolves and the mountain lions, and perhaps to some extent the bears have essentially turned, you can think of about turning elk biomass, so the mass of elk, into kind of a more diverse range of herbivore species.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So you've got more pronghorns, you've got more bison, you've got more moose. I think there's a few more deer. I don't know if
more mule deer.
Yeah,
we're seeing, and there's two species of deer. There's the mule deer and the white-tailed deer, and I'm seeing more of those as well.
And what about the vegetation? So that's the kind of story that Syma was talking about at the beginning. This forests recovering, it's, and obviously I know what it looks like over there now. But I mean, what's your take on the kind of vegetation changes? Because you've actually spent quite a bit of time working on aspen.
Yes, I have. So my students and I have shown that there's a link between aspen regeneration or recruitment. When I use the word recruitment, I mean small aspen saplings turning into tall aspen saplings that can escape herbivory from elk. And so that's the key. That's been the key metric, is how tall these aspen are, because elk basically browse saplings as high as maybe 3 meters. Once they get past 3 meters, they've sort of survived and they've become mature trees. And so there's a link between the rate at which saplings, recruit, join the overstory, and elk density. And so as elk densities decreased from that high of 19,000 prior to the wolf reintroduction, as those densities decreased, recruitment started to increase because there was less browsing pressure on those saplings. And so in some places, we do have the regeneration of aspen stands that were sort of just hanging on and actually disappearing at the time that I started in 1995. But that isn't the whole story. That's only some aspen stands in some places, and it's actually the minority of aspen stands. The remarkable and somewhat disheartening thing is that most of the aspen stands, according to the analyses that we've done, have actually continued to decline since the wolf reintroduction, and despite the reduction in elk density. And we're still trying to work out why that is, but we think a lot of it has to do with the fact that throughout this last 30-year period, conditions for plants overall have become drier. There's basically more water stress on plants, and aspen are a deciduous tree. They require a lot of moisture. They tend to live in sort of wetter sites. And so we think this increased water stress might be contributing to the decline overall, the net decrease in aspen stand area.
So why don't we bring beavers back into the park? Because they, we know they make dams. That builds up water. Wouldn't you get the more aspen coming back?
As a result of the beaver. As a result of the beaver?
Yeah.
No, so I think the causal relationship's the other way around.
Yeah.
So Tim's teasing me, I think. So the beaver eat the aspen, they eat the willow. They need those things to build their dams and their lodges. And in places like Crystal Creek and in Blacktail Creek, where we've had substantial regeneration of aspen and crystal and willow and blacktail, we do have beaver recolonizing those sites. Those beaver were not there when I started 30 years ago, nor were there lodges or dams because there was no aspen or willow or very little. But now 30 years later, it's there. I mean, I was out tramping around in Blacktail Creek and Crystal Creek just a few weeks ago, and some of these dams are actually quite large. But what I also found, in addition to actually seeing a beaver, is I also found evidence of predation on beavers. So beaver are oftentimes referred to as sort of, tasty snacks, sort of meat packages for predators.
For wolves,
they're very slow. They've got, there's lots of meat there. And they will be picked off by predators. And that's what we found evidence for. So there is sort of this push and pull. On one hand, the predators have contributed to beaver recovery by indirectly increasing aspen and willow in some areas. And so beaver have come back. But then all of a sudden, those beaver are exposed to predation and they're getting picked off. And so there's sort of this dynamic, and we're still waiting to see how it all works out. We would assume that these beaver dams that have lost beaver as a result of predation will continue to be maintained by other beavers that come and take their place. But it's kind of part of the story that's still unfolding.
So Dan, for just thinking about all the different things we've talked about lots of different species, both in terms of sort of flora and fauna. And do they have differences in their recovery and times and their response times? So, for example, you reintroduce the wolves, stuff happens to elks, stuff happens to bison, stuff happens to aspen. Is that on a similar time scale, or do different things happen to different things on different time scales, if that makes sense?
In terms of like recovery?
Yeah. So in terms of seeing the impact and then for it to recover.
Yeah, and I think the problem is even more basic than that. I mean, what defines recovery? When people talk about aspen recovery, I always scratch my head and wonder exactly what they mean, because that's a term that my graduate student, Lainey Bryce, and I struggled with a lot because you see it in the literature. And so we have to figure out, well, how do you define recovery? And then you have to, assess the extent to which the degree to different things reach that, threshold varies over time and varies between different species. And I don't think I have a very good answer for you, to be honest with you, because I think this system is still unfolding in terms of what it is going to look like. And nobody really predicted the current state of the system as we see it today with all these bison and even all the aspen and willow. I mean, there were some people that were probably expecting some regeneration of aspen and willow before the wolf reintroduction, but that wasn't part of any of the predictions that were being made formally in the literature. It was all about the impact of wolves on the ungulate numbers and that sort of thing, hunter opportunities outside the park. The vegetation wasn't on anybody's radar. And we don't really know what's going to happen next because we do have climate warming. And so that's one of the questions we're working on now, is to what extent are these sort of effects, these cascading effects of predators, including wolves, are those going to be muted or offset by, opposing effects of climate warming and water stress on plants?
But so when you go to Yellowstone these days, Simon, when you drive along the area that Dan's talking about, you'll come up to some of these streams and you'll see little bits of kind of forest coming back, and some of it, some pretty big trees in some areas. But actually, most of it, what you see is kind of sagebrush, isn't it? So
sagebrush and grassland, yeah.
Yeah. So it hasn't this kind of idea that the forests have come back throughout the northern range, and that's kind of led to the rivers changing. Isn't really quite it's patchy, isn't it? It's kind of it's a heterogeneous landscape with all sorts of different things going on.
I mean, if that's a massive exaggeration, this cartoonish, story that we've heard over and over again for years, it's just not true. Yes, you can find examples of it, but they're quite limited. in the aspen stands that we've studied, we tracked the fates of 80 different aspen stands from 1954 to 2022, and 90% of those stands continue to decline despite the wolf reintroduction. Only 10% of them have increased, including the largest one that is sort of the famous Crystal Creek aspen stand that everybody sees when they drive to Yellowstone because they drive right by it. So it's very visible, but that's actually a real exception. Most aspen stands are substantially smaller, and we've had aspen stands disappear since wolf reintroduction.
So it's a really complicated system, Syma, actually.
Yeah, no, it seems to be, despite, I guess, in a way, it being a kind of self-contained model system as well. It's the complexity is kind of mind-boggling. But so it leads me on to what next for you, Dan? What are you sort of interested in now? What are you keenly observing, and what's, you know, what next is the big thing?
For me, it's continuing this journey of incorporating into my thinking all these other species in the food web, and really thinking about Northern Yellowstone not as a system dominated by wolves, but really as a food web that's dominated by a lot of different species. You know, bison, moose, the other carnivores. I mean, I think that's one of the big things that has changed in the last 30 years amongst the researchers that focus on this system, is we're not thinking about it solely in terms of wolves and elk, which is how I've thought about it for, you know, years. We're thinking about it more of as a community of predators interacting with a community of herbivores, and then we're also trying to get beyond the aspen and the willow. We're trying to think more broadly about the grass that actually is the primary food for these herbivores, the elk and the bison in particular. So elk, you know, eat mainly the grass, and the fate of the grasslands is a legitimate question in and of itself, particularly in the case of warming, because we deal with invasive grass species in Yellowstone National Park that are favored by warming. And these species, things like cheatgrass, they've begun to colonize the lower elevations that are hospitable to them because it's warm enough. But as warming starts to, you know, continue to accelerate, those species could potentially colonize further up into the higher elevations, with, you know, potentially negative consequences on the herbivore community that relies primarily on the grasses. So expanding our scope of inquiry is really kind of I think the future for Yellowstone research, and getting away from just this wolf-centric research program.
If only we had early career postdoc who was building models
Yes.
of Yellowstone, called Willem Bonifay, who's
Yes.
we're actually, this is why Dan's over in Oxford, because you know, we're working with this you know, this wonderful postdoc Willem, who's actually building these complicated models that'll hopefully provide some novel insight.
Absolutely, because that's part of the reason why we haven't been able to really tackle these issues empirically, is we haven't had the quantitative tools to do so. And so that's what Willem is developing, and that's what's really so exciting. Is like, for the first time, we'll have sort of an integrated model for bringing together all these different components in a really mechanistic way to understand these relationships.
You're talking my language, mechanistic understanding. That I get.
All right.
You
cool.
know, this is where we collide, Syma, with our methods and what have you. But I think, I mean, thanks very much, Dan, for coming on.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
Kind of, it's fascinating. And the Yellowstone story just continues, I think, because when that video came out, I mean, in fairness to George Monbiot, who made it, I mean, that's kind of what the science was pointing at. The whole point, it's a journey, isn't it? It's
there were a series of papers that led people to believe that was what was going on, but those were all very preliminary results.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And so I think it will continue. The park will continue to change. I have no doubt about it. We'll have
Absolutely.
this conversation in 10 years, and we'll say, no one predicted that moose were going to become super. Well, and then Dan will say, no, well, actually, I did. Just go back. Anyway, perhaps on that note, it's time to finish. So thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you,
for
Tim.
coming
Thank
along
you,
and
Simon.
spending the time talking to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that was interesting, Simon. What did you make of that? I mean, you're you know, I known quite a lot of that story. It's still fascinating to hear it, of course, but what's your take?
I was a bit blown away, to be honest. So much to take away. First, just the incredible story of you know, the wolves sort of being taken away from just the historical aspects being taken away from Yellowstone, reintroduced, the impact on the elks, and I think, you know, the elk numbers going down, going up, and then sort of down, and then stabilizing, and I think And the fact that, it's being looked beyond, sort of looking at things beyond wolves and elks now onto the, the flora as well. I think it's actually quite a lot to sort of process, to be
No,
honest.
and it's true. It's an iconic study, the
Yeah.
Yellowstone study, particularly, I mean, the wolf study, this is, the longest and most in-depth study of recognizable wolves that have got collars on that's ever been undertaken. And the fact that there's all these other bits of research on the elk and the bison and the moose and the aspen and the
Yeah.
willow,
Yeah.
the beavers and all sorts of, and the mountain lions, is makes it really unusual and makes it a special study. And wolves have had an effect, but it's really interesting that it's not the clear wolves change rivers that we'd all
No.
come. But I don't want to knock that video too much because it has made people aware of how important predators can be on landscapes.
I think for me also the resolution of the information. At one point you sort of said, oh, there's 100 wolves, and the answer came out there's 108, and it
Yeah.
was that level of detail, I think, which for me was astonishing. I hadn't realized it was at quite that level.
No, it really is. My pet wolf has just gone rushing out, barking in the background. I've been picked up. But no, I mean, it's things are studied in great detail. Each pack will have two wolves with radio collars on, so we can find each pack, on a regular every few days to work out where they are, and then we can see which other wolves are in the pack, whether there's been any, any young born, whether they've then come out of the burrows. So no, it's a huge, astonishing amount of data, and I mean, it's somewhere that having listened to that, do you think you'll next time you're in the US, will you swing by Yellowstone, have a look round?
Love to, honestly. And, I was just sort of playing back in my mind some of these images of people sort of out of helicopters firing darts, and, the salmon fishing nets. It's just such a different scale of science to what I do. It's just different. And I think I'm really struck by it, to be honest.
No, it was good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And of course, we're both using maths to model
Yeah.
systems, right? Whether they're at the very small scale of individual molecules that you're looking at or at the whole ecosystem scale. So, but no, it was great to have Dan on. I really enjoyed chatting to
Yeah,
him.
what a great guest.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll have a good week. And then next week in our podcast, our football skills are going to be put to the test.
Yeah, I might have to get a bit of practice in over the weekend.
Have you got a football?
I do, actually.
Thank God for that, because I haven't. I think I might have to buy one. Okay. Excellent. Well, good chatting to you, Syma.
Yeah, you too.
Have a good week, and I'll talk to you soon.
Cool. Take care, Tim.
Yeah. Bye.